Well, good morning and welcome to this latest devotional podcast from Holy Trinity Leicester, where we're continuing a series looking through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah as we think about the themes of restoration and return. And today we've got to Ezra chapter 9, that great prayer, one of the 999 prayers of the Old Testament, that alongside Nehemiah 9 and Daniel 9 are prayers out of desperation that really connect with the heart of God. And Ezra 9 in his prayer does one thing, and one thing alone that I want us to look at today. In it, he confesses. This morning, as I am recording this, a story has emerged in the news through the Black Lives Matter movement of David Gelpin, who formerly led Hope City Church, which is a network of 12 large Pentecostal churches across the nation, actually across the globe. And he's resigned from leading those churches because he confessed he was a racist. He said in his statement, "I've always had a vision of creating a diverse, multicultural church. But because we were getting, for a period of time, fewer white people attending in Sheffield, I tried to make the church more appealing to what I thought white people wanted. I've realised in the past week that this is completely racist, that I've contributed and added to generations and centuries of racism over Earth and have hurt many people, both in the past and in the present, and I am deeply sorry." I have to admit that when I first heard that news, I was deeply shocked and saddened. Just another sign of institutional racism, not just in the world, but in the church. Felt ashamed that the world could rightly say of many of us that we're no different to the worst amongst them. But then I realised that something had been modelled in that story and what David had done that was godly and honouring in it. He'd confessed. He'd not been recorded being a racist. He'd not been forced to say that he was a racist by others. But through the conviction of the Holy Spirit, he'd come to a realisation of his racism, which led him to confess it for God and before others and resign. And it spoke volumes, I think. Yes, there is the most awful sin amongst God's people, even its leaders. But there is a power that God gives to be used against it, the power of confession. And I think that was what David Gilpin was seeking to use to deal with his own sin and also the sin so prevalent in the church, sadly. In our passage, Ezra also uses the power of confession. He hasn't sinned personally, but his people have. Intermarrying with the nations that worship other gods, which God had warned them not to. That was a habit that had previously corrupted their worship of God and led them to worship other gods in their history, which led to sin and judgment and exile. And now they've been graciously returned back to the land out of exile. And Ezra hears in our chapter that they've started doing it again. They hadn't learnt, they hadn't changed. And when Ezra hears this, he goes into deep mourning, others do as well. He tears his clothes, he plucks hair from his beard and head as a sign of it. And then we read in verse 5, he prays. And fascinatingly, his prayer first doesn't seem to be a very powerful prayer. All he seems to do is say before God what had happened in the past with their previous sins, what God had said previously about the sin of intermarriage and how it would lead to idol worship, and now what they've done in actually doing that again. He was telling God things he already knew. There's no asking for forgiveness in this prayer. There's no prayer for transformation. He's just simply confessing out loud what their sin had been, past and present. However, this simple act, as we'll see in the next chapter, changes everything. It galvanizes the people to deal with this sin, and then leads to a radical transformation where this sin is dealt with. And I think Ezra knew what we often miss, and that is the simple power of confession that he was doing on behalf of the people, because they didn't know how to do it. Confession which brings sin to light so it can be dealt with, rather than just lurking in the depths and poisoning us in the background. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 5:11 through to 13, that we are to expose sin publicly before God out loud. And he says why? Because all things, when they're exposed, are revealed by the light. But everything that becomes visible is light. That when sin is brought into the light, openly confessed, it's robbed of its power to hide, to evade being destroyed. And then it just encounters the light of Christ, which purifies and transforms. For us, we can often feel that confession of sin is something that's a bit religious, can be a bit scary, or even a bit silly. Simply saying out loud what God already knows, and so do we. But if we think those things, we miss its power to deal with the things inside that fragment and corrupt and poison our lives. Sin that so easily evades detection and stays in hiding. It's interesting that also in the news this morning was another story. A breakthrough moment in oceanography. 1/5 of the planet's seabed has now finally been mapped by oceanographers. A momentous achievement. But at the same time, I realised as I read that story, it meant that 80% of the seabed is still unmapped. It's shrouded in mystery, and who knows what dwells in them, in those places. And in our souls, as it were, there are unmapped depths where sin dwells, in murky waters far from light. But in confession, when we confess, they're mapped, they're brought to the surface, brought to the light of Christ and dealt with. And I wonder today, what do you need to confess out loud before the Lord? Maybe you need to find someone you can confess with. Maybe you need to find someone you can trust and that you can just say, I've done this. This is what I've been doing. This is what I've been struggling with. Or maybe it's just between you and the Lord. Saying out loud what you know He knows and what you know, but what needs to be said out loud. So that sin can be exposed. It can be brought to the light of Christ and dealt with. How are you going to make use of the power of confession today?